Good morning.
Good morning.
How you doing?
Doing okay.
Good.
Although on a day like today where it's drizzly and dark, I could have stayed in bed all day really easy.
Yeah.
Hey,
Oh,
Rob.
absolutely.
Hey,
Hey, good morning, Rob.
good morning. No Miller this morning.
Okay, okay. Well, it will probably be just us three then. Um, so let's see. I'm gonna go ahead since oh gosh, I can't believe it's already 10. Actually, I thought time keeps on slipping into the future. Um,
There's something funny in the chat settings. It doesn't have everyone as an option.
oh, you're right. I
It's,
haven't hit that yet. Thank you.
okay.
All right. And we seem to be a little slim on our usual crowd today. So, um, well, Uh, even so, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, let's see. How about Rob, could you be the liturgist today? And
Sure.
Paula, could you be the voice of the people?
Gladly.
All right. And then if Rob, if you would do the gospel reading, um, Paula, if you could do the Hebrew Bible reading. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, let me go ahead and pull the screen up and we'll get started.
All right. On this day in 1939, Mohandas Gandhi, in order to protest British colonial rule of India, began a hunger strike. This was part of his nonviolent resistance philosophy of satyagraha, or truth force. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King would later adopt a similar phrase, soul force. Later in life, Gandhi said that he read the words of the Sermon on the Mount every day. Today is World Wildlife Day, established by the United Nations to raise awareness of wildlife in general and endangered species in particular. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Hear these words of invitation.
The hospitality of God knows no bounds.
The love of God is immeasurable.
The generosity of God is beyond our wildest dreams.
We gather today as invited ones,
As beloved ones,
as blessed ones.
draw near and let us break the bread of life.
Today's responsive reading comes from Psalm 19. Heaven is declaring God's glory. The sky is proclaiming his handiwork.
One day gushes the news to the next, and one night informs another what needs to be known.
Of course, there's no speech, no words. Their voices can't be heard.
But their sounds extend throughout the world. Their words reach the end of the earth.
God has made a tent in heaven for the sun.
The sun is like a groom coming out of his honeymoon suite. Like a warrior, it thrills at the running its course.
It rises in one end of the sky. Its circuit is complete at the other.
Nothing escapes its heat.
The Lord's instruction is perfect, reviving one's very being.
The Lord's laws are faithful, making naive people wise.
The Lord's regulations are right, gladdening the heart.
The Lord's commands are pure, giving light to the eyes.
Honoring the Lord is correct, lasting forever.
The Lord's judgments are true. All of these are righteous.
They are more desirable than gold, than tons of pure gold.
They are sweeter than honey, even dripping off the honeycomb.
No doubt about it. Your servant is enlightened by them. There is great reward in keeping them.
But can anyone know what they've accidentally done wrong?
Sorry, I doubled you up there.
But can anyone know what they've accidentally done wrong?
But that's
There's two lines,
I
Paula.
have it bolded for you, Paula. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry.
Hmm.
Clear me of any unknown sin and save your servant from willful sins.
Don't let them rule me.
Then I'll be completely blameless. I'll be innocent of great wrongdoing.
Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart
Be pleasing to you, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. The Hebrew Bible reading is from Exodus, the 20th chapter, verses 1 through 17. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You must have no other gods before me. Do not make an idol for yourself, no form whatsoever, of anything in the sky above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow down to them or worship them, because I, the Lord your God, am a passionate God. I punish children for their parents' sin, even to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. But I am loyal and gracious to the thousandth generation of those who love and keep my commandments. Do not use the Lord your God's name as if it were of no significance. The Lord won't forgive anyone who uses his name that way. Remember the Sabbath day and treat it as holy. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it, not you, your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you, because the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them in 6 days, but rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother so that your life will be long on the fertile land that the Lord your God is giving you. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not testify falsely against your neighbor. Do not desire and try to take your neighbor's house. Do not desire to take, do not desire and try to take your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox, donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor.
The gospel reading comes from the second chapter of John. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple those who were selling cattle, sheep, and doves, as well as those involved in exchanging currency, sitting there. He made a whip from ropes and chased them all out of the temple, including the cattle and the sheep. He scattered the coins and overturned the tables of those who exchanged currency. He said to the dove sellers, "Get these things out of here. Don't make my father's house a place of business." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Passion for your house consumes me." Then the Jewish leaders asked him, "By what authority are you doing these things? What miraculous sign will you show us?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." The Jewish leaders replied, "It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But the temple Jesus was talking about was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. May God bless the hearing of this word.
Thanks be to God.
In his book, Inspiration and Incarnation, Peter ends writing about the differences between the Ten Commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy, writes, God seems to be perfectly willing to allow his law to be adjusted over time. In other words, there seems to be a situational dimension to law, just as there is with wisdom literature. Law is God's revelation, but does that necessarily mean that it is static and unbending? For any biblical law we can think of, obedience is much more than simply do what it says. One must understand whether the present situation calls for that law and how that law is to be kept.
So thank you all for getting us started with worship today. We'll continue with prayer. I will get us started with prayer. And those of you who are listening, if you're on Zoom or if you're on YouTube or Facebook, you can simply put a prayer request in the comments and we'll incorporate that into our prayer. Since there's three of us on the panel, I'll keep an eye on YouTube. Would someone keep an eye on Facebook? Thank you. Thanks, Rob. So let's go to God in prayer. Gracious God, even as we see the beauty of this world, it terrifies us. And even as we dread the future, we have hope for better outcomes. We are a mixture of conflicting emotions and desires. Especially when we regard our fellow human beings, we may feel frustration, anger, love, gratitude, pity. We confess that we often fear our neighbors rather than love them, but we also know that perfect love casts out fear. Help us to see each other and the world with the same compassionate eyes and steer all our aims toward growing our love and reducing suffering. Even though we know pain is inevitable, God, help us to hold all your creatures in our hearts and wish that all your creation may be safe, happy, and at ease. God, we long for this kind of Sabbath rest that helps us be free from both work and worry. Give us peace that passes understanding, that lets us put all things into your hands, since that's where they are anyway. I invite those of you listening, if you have prayer requests, to share them also.
For Daryl Hardy,
Lord,
Lord,
hear our
hear our
prayer.
prayer.
For Diane Hurst,
Lord, hear our prayer.
for
For
continued
Ruth,
healing for
go ahead.
for continued healing for Ruth Weaver,
Lord, hear our prayer.
for Connie Grindle,
Lord, hear our prayer.
and for Eleanor Schwartz.
Lord, hear our prayer.
Prayers for Hakika Bowling and a speedy recovery.
Lord, hear our prayer. For Ayana,
Lord, hear our prayer.
For safe travels for those traveling.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For Merle Ayers,
Lord, hear our prayer.
God, for those that we've named and those who remain unnamed, we give you thanks that you hear our prayers and that you answer. And we join the prayer that Jesus taught us, saying, Holy One, our Mother and Father, let your name be revered. Let your reign come. Let your will be done on earth as it is in the heavens. Give us today the bread we need for today, and forgive our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For yours is the sovereignty, the power, and the glory, now and forever. Amen.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that when people talk about putting the Ten Commandments up in courthouses or in public places, they don't actually talk about putting the full Ten Commandments, right? It's it's interesting because the whole text kind of throws things in, puts things in context, and I'm not sure that most people would actually want this printed on courthouses or monuments out in front of places, especially this first one. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That actually wouldn't be a bad way to start it, right? Especially if we were putting up a monument, just as a reminder that sometimes people oppress other people, and that if you're in the position to keep the Ten Commandments, it's probably because you've been liberated from something. I mean, I think that's really needs to be the setting for all the Ten Commandments. These commandments apply for people who have been freed from slavery. If you're still in slavery, maybe you don't have the opportunity to be kind to your male and female servants, right? I mean, part of the idea behind keeping the commandments, and this is pervasive through Jewish thought, is that you have the ability to keep them. God doesn't expect people to keep them who can't keep them. That's throughout Jewish theology, throughout Jewish thinking. So the commands, the Torah, which Torah, by the way, means law, excuse me, the commands were called mitzvah. Like you've heard of bar mitzvah. This is the command you do for a son. A bat mitzvah is the commandment you carry out for a daughter, that these are rituals that God commands. These are rites of passage. So that's usually where non-Jews hear the word mitzvah. But a mitzvah is any command. These are all mitzvot is the plural. These are all mitzvot. They're commands. And because of our Western way of thinking, we hear these words like law and command, and we think in very authoritarian terms, like law's the law. Don't break the law or you'll be punished. But law for Jewish people tended to mean something more like natural law, like the law of gravity, like the law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy. These are immutable parts of creation. The law is not just do this, don't do that, or you'll be punished. It's this is the way that life works. And when you read the Ten Commandments from that perspective, I think it puts an interesting twist on it. And this is why I don't think, it's kind of uh, it kind of pushes against the idea of law the way we have it in courthouses. If you were to take these Ten Commandments and you were to put them in a courthouse, you would really need to reframe the whole idea of law and think of it in more practical terms, because that's how Jews thought of it. These are practical laws. This is what we do to make things work. And so that's also why you wouldn't, if you were putting this on a monument, you wouldn't probably want to include some of these other things. Don't make any idol for yourself, no form whatsoever of anything in the sky above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Don't bow down to them or worship them, because I, the Lord your God, am a passionate God. And then there's this bit, which, by the way, kind of rankles us if you're, more progressive theology. I punish children for their parents' sins, even to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. Wow, what a jerk to punish the children for the sins of the fathers and mothers, right? That's interesting. In fact, not many Jews cared for this particular phrasing. That's why later on in the prophets, you find the prophets pushing back against this verse. No longer will I punish children for the sins of their parents, God says in Isaiah. And in another prophet, it says that we used to say that the parents have eaten sour grapes and it's set the children's teeth on edge, but no longer will we say that. Now it's if you eat the grapes, it's your teeth that are set on edge. So the prophets actually push back against this verse because they don't see it as just that God would punish children for what their parents did. Even in the verse itself, there's an inherent contradiction. I punish children for their parents' sin, even to the third and fourth generation, but I'm loyal and gracious to the thousandth generation of those who keep my commandments. So if you're loyal and God's supposed to be generous for the thousandth generation, but your grandchildren, 2 or 3 generations, they don't love God, then God's thrown into a conflict, right? Now I got to be loyal for thousands of generations. But you see, obviously, this is not procedural law, right? This is a description of who God is. God is far more generous than punitive. That's really what the author is saying, right? God is way more generous than punitive. But God's don't mess around, right? That's the idea behind this. That's never going to be on a courthouse wall. These actual verses aren't ever going to be there. That's why they truncate them. They take them off. The Sabbath, likewise, has commentary, even here in the law. 6 days you may work and do all your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. Do not do any work on it. We have thrown the Sabbath so far out of our conception. I mean, the whole idea behind our society, behind creeping capitalism, is that more work and more productivity is better. And we would rather, if No one ever had a day off. But because these were escaped slaves, oh, remember that first verse, the escaped slaves bit. Because these were escaped slaves, they've really valued free time. And the whole idea was that life isn't just about work, that one day out of the week, everybody gets a day off. And that absolutely means everybody. Not you, not your sons or daughters, your male or female servants, your animals, or the immigrant who is living with you. It goes down the list of those who have power, right? You don't do any work, but you also can't make your sons and daughters mow the grass or wash the car. You're not supposed to do any work, but you also can't just demand that Amazon deliver on Sundays. I mean, can you imagine what would happen if we actually enforced the Sabbath as a law? That's really where the commentary ends, by the way. The rest are pretty truncated, right? Don't kill, don't commit adultery. I think it almost feels like the author felt like these didn't need much explanation. That perhaps do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, like those are pretty obvious. I don't need to tell you why. So even as the author is writing this and including commentary, there's obviously a kind of understanding that some laws require some explanation, some laws require some commentary, some don't, and these are not the kinds of laws like we understand laws. These are laws that are here's a good way to live. This is again like the law of gravity, like the law of thermodynamics. In fact, in other places in the Bible, it explicitly says, do these and live. Like, this is how you're supposed to live. Now, the little quote that I chose to include from Pete Enns talks later on. If you read these 10 commandments in Exodus, and then you go back and you read the 10 commandments in Deuteronomy, which happens several chapters later, or a couple books later, you'll see that there are some differences. One of the big differences is that the lines about Sabbath also include slaves, and that there's much more references to slaves, which again is kind of problematic from modern perspective, especially when that first line is, remember, I freed you from slavery, now keep these commandments. Pete Enns says, perhaps the authors of the Bible realized that you needed to contextualize some things a little bit differently. Things had changed by the time Deuteronomy happened. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, it's Moses reciting the Ten Commandments to the people with a few editorial comments, a few changes. So apparently, the editorial component is almost just as important as the law itself. And this is why, for Jewish people, they had the Talmud. So, as I said, Torah, that means law. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. The Talmud is a series of commentaries written on the Torah, which Jewish rabbis and scribes passed first orally, generation to generation, and finally they wrote it down. So the Talmud has a lot of explanations and kind of interpretations. This is how we apply the law. And in fact, even if you think about American law, we do the same thing. The law isn't just something written in a book. It's also, there's a tradition, there's judges' commentary, there's explanations for why this is the way it is. And for Jews, it was the same way. The Talmud also became important. So oftentimes we read the Torah and we say, gosh, this God sounds like a pretty harsh God. The Talmud is often trying to take a couple of steps back and paint God as not quite so harsh, as a little more reasonable. And the commentary has a lot to do with that. For example, a lot of times in the Old Testament, I hear a lot of progressive Christians talk about this too. There's verses that really offend our sensibilities. Like if you don't honor your father and mother, if a son is disobedient, you should stone that disobedient son, right? That disobedience to parents is a capital offense. Now, the fact is, most Jews were not stoning their children to death, right? And there's an explanation in the Talmud that says for any capital case, for any capital crime for which you might apply the death penalty, that you had to have 2 witnesses, and there's a variety of different explanations about about when something actually qualifies as a capital crime. But one of the commentaries I find most fascinating is that if a council sentenced more than one person to death every 7 years, that council was called a murderous council, a bloodthirsty council. So capital punishment must have not been that common, right? Especially for things like being disobedient to parents. Just like some of the comments, some of the editorial statements up here, I think this is more like an editorial statement. I don't think this is God speaking. I think this is an author giving a little bit of explanation, right? And I think possibly that author on that particular day was having some family trouble. The fact is, people were not running around stoning people. People did not read this law in the heavy-handed, authoritarian way that we often read it today when we read it as religious scripture. The law was meant to be practical. It was meant to help people live. And so reading these 10 commandments, following the 10 commandments, was really about this is the best way to live, not killing people, not stealing. And that's why you've got some commentary and some without, because people were actually remarkably reasonable back in the day. They were not crazy. And I think we would have to be crazy to take these 10 commandments and slap them in courthouses today and expect people to read them as law. Except the last bit, which obviously doesn't need commentary. That's what I wanted to share with you all today. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, reflections on uh, Torah, on law, or the Ten Commandments.
The Baptist churches I grew up in had their own set of Torah. They were called the bylaws. And you could take every single bylaw if you had the time and trace it back to one of those days when someone wasn't having a particularly good day with their son or with another church member. Uh, some of them were ridiculous
Yeah,
and are still there. The church I grew up in has a thing where you can get kicked out of the church for dancing, and yet these days they have held dances for the teenagers.
absolutely. Well, and I think those things are like, Alabama has a law. One of my favorites is you can't wear a fake mustache in church. And you read about these laws that different states have that are just wild and crazy laws. Like you can't carry an ice cream cone in your back pocket, and someone
It's
did
against
something, and someone wrote,
it's
like you're saying,
it's against the law to spit on the sidewalk in Alabama.
yes, absolutely. And it's probably like one person was targeted by that law. Hey, the funny thing is, like you're saying, Paula, it's not uncommon for groups of people to like rather than actually talk about their differences to try to put it in writing or law. Like, I don't know how many churches or how
That's
many
what
groups of people.
HOAs do.
Exactly. It's the HOAs. It's the HOA approach. Like, one person's doing something, so rather than go talk to that person, let's make a rule that you can't blah 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 blah. Yes.
That pisses everybody off.
Yes.
I
Right.
have a friend who lives in an HOA area,
Hmm.
and she was given this beautiful statue for Christmas from her parents that was 37 inches tall, and it was an angel type thing that she put in her front yard. And the next day, had someone show up saying that the bylaw said you couldn't have anything in your yard taller than 36 inches, and her angel was 1 inch too tall, and they had to move it to the backyard so nobody could see it.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Those are the places like yes, this is when you're going to rebel by putting pink flamingos everywhere, but they're under 36 inches tall or something, you know. I remember reading about someone who was upset that you can't grow vegetables, you can only grow grass in your front yard. And so he grew corn and apparently was able to get away with it because corn is a grass or something like that. It was some kind of very tall grass, but the idea was, behold, here's your grass.
Yeah. Oh boy. So I put in the chat that HOA stands for home owning authoritarians.
Okay.
We don't have to make the whole conversation about HOAs, but I
Yeah.
will just point out that if you read the book Color of Law, you'll
Mm.
also learn a lot about the many layered onion of, residential segregation in the United States, and how explicit government policy from the federal level down to, like, the most basic municipal level has promulgated just one awful thing after another. And HOAs, similar to segregation academies, are just one
Yeah.
more manifestation of that. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's Nazis all the way down. As far as the Ten Commandments, I think one of the axes that very sort of evangelical people have to grind often, or very just very conservative folks, right? Is they're very worried about antinomianism.
Hmm.
Like, oh, are you saying there's no rules? There have to be rules, right? And I
Hmm.
mean, you even hear. I mean, I've anecdotally heard, people like they heard their uncle or their grandfather or somebody say something like, well, if I didn't have these rules, I would have just gone around raping women. It's like, well,
Yes.
thanks for that confession. Um,
Yeah.
so I think your point about what this law actually is really interesting to me. Because people are like, well, if there are no rules, then and it's like, well, wait a minute. We're not saying that there won't be good sense,
Hmm.
right? The choice, it's a false binary, as binaries tend to be,
Hmm.
between absolute lawless, just, I guess, rioting in the streets and raping and pillaging and setting things on fire, and, utter collapse of civilization. Let's just make an apocalyptic movie out of it. Mad Max.
Yeah.
We'll call that
Yeah.
Mad Max. It's either that or what? Ruled by benevolent theocratic Nazis seems to be the
Hmm.
choice that's currently on offer. And I just wish we could break through that to say, no, we're just talking about having good sense.
Hmm.
I mean, at the risk of offering a perspective that comes from a very, very hyper local place of parenting. I have a 5-year old, and currently she is enjoying My Little Pony.
Hmm.
And there was a My Little Pony movie yesterday, about, and I don't know when this was made. It's recent, but in the past few years or something. But like, so apparently, and you're about to get into the My Little Pony lore. This is all
Oh,
new to
that's
me.
fine. Go for
But
it.
like, so you have the Earth ponies, you have the unicorns, and you have the Pegasus or Pegasi, I guess they say.
Hmm.
But like, the magic is all broken. Like the Pegasus, they can't fly anymore, and the unicorns can't do magic stuff with their horns anymore. And like, they've got these crystals that they think, or they sort of figure out, like, that's sort of the plot. It's like, well, if we put these crystals back together, oh, magically we'll get the magic back. But it doesn't happen that way.
Hmm.
And then, one of the ponies realizes, oh, we have to choose friendship.
Oh, of course. Right.
If we choose friendship, we can all be friends again. And that brings the magic back. And it's like, you know what? When you're pitching this to 5-year-olds, I don't know that you can put it any better than that. The problem is we
Absolutely.
get older and we think that applies less. And I watched this movie and I was like, you go, My Little Pony. Like, this is actually, it really is that simple, isn't it? Like, we
Yeah.
can choose friendship. Or thinking about, the immortal words of Captain Kirk in a Taste of Armageddon,
Yeah.
we're savage killers with a million years of violence behind us, but we can change that if we just choose not to kill today.
Yes. Yeah.
I cannot kill today.
Yeah.
Like, can we not make those kind of choices, offer those kind of propositions, and say the law is good
Hmm.
sense? Let's be a
Yeah.
community, um, instead of this paranoid, fearful, controlling place where you open your door, and it's like, well, I mean, what is open carry,
Hmm.
honestly,
Yeah. Right.
except the expectation that you don't live in a real community.
Hmm.
You live in a failed society that is a war zone, and
Yeah.
and you have to protect yourself from that because all these other bastards can't be trusted.
Right.
And
That
we're in
nobody should want to live in that world. That's awful.
Exactly. Yeah.
we're in election season in Alabama.
Yeah.
Tuesday's the big day, and the ads on TV, the only reason they're there is to divide people. My favorite one that just makes me cringe every time it comes on is this woman who's running to be judge. And basically, she says the only thing between a Christian nation and total chaos is me. Uh, which, relating that back to the Ten Commandments, it seems the people who are most adamant about wanting to post the commandments are the ones who most blatantly disobey the commandments, because thou shalt have no other God before me includes the state, the
Yeah.
nation, power, and these ads are strictly from power hungry people.
Yeah.
Um, it breaks my heart. We have forgotten how to be community, and we're just getting more and more
Mm.
divided.
Rob, something that you said that I want to go back to, talking about this idea of, and also Paul thinking about this idea of choosing friendship or trust, like choosing trust over division. I've been reading John Gottman's book, The Science of Trust, and he talks about how there were some surveys done of different, like, regionally high trust and low trust societies. Like, Brazil is a very low trust society. The southeastern United States is a very low trust society, and that a lot of this goes along with, economic inequality. Also, I mean, unfortunately, some things like how homogenous a country is. Norway was a very high trust society, but it has very low diversity, right? But also low economic inequality and that kind of stuff. And kind of these measures of power um, have a lot to do with whether or not people trust each other. And I do think in a lot of ways, kind of like the idea that, as you were saying, Rob, as parents, we are trying to give rules or give boundaries for kids. And this is a common analogy for how God uses law. Like, here's the boundaries, and you've got an enormous amount of freedom within those boundaries to do whatever, right? And the idea is the boundaries are there to keep you from falling off a cliff, right? You know, they're really there for your protection. Because if you start doing any of these things, killing, stealing, yada yada yada, it's going to come back on you. So there's kind of a utilitarian ethics component to this. Um, but really, the idea is, I mean, that's the utilitarian idea. But really, it's about character formation. Like, what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of kids are you hoping to raise? And I feel like with Torah, that from the Jewish perspective, they're saying, look, here's the natural law. This is kind of the way the world works. This is the way society works. You do these things, you'll live. Things will go well for you. You don't do these things, society's going to go, it's going to be heading south real fast. And I think one of the powerful things about this is, like, first off, and to me, this is, you've heard me say this is rooted in my theology. We don't make images of God because your neighbor's in the image of God. Like, all you got to do is look at your neighbor, and if that's the image of God over there, if, oh yeah, that's what God looks like, that should affect everything you do. Like, everything is based on that, treating other people as though they're in the image of God, and you're not putting that God somewhere else, like you said, Paul, like a state or like a statue or celebrity or something like that. And that somehow all this flows from that.
Thinking about the parenting angle, I'm reminded of a like an old Calvin and Hobbes panel where he's just sitting there pounding nails into the coffee table. There's like just tons of nails, like it's
Oh,
it's ruined. And his mom comes running in, like, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's like, is this a trick question?
Yes.
And it's that what are you thinking moment. Something came to me when in what you were saying, Dave. Like, well, what really came to my mind was, the little three-letter code, for texting shorthand or whatever, FFS, which
Hmm.
I'll be polite enough not to
Yeah.
unpack that. I'll reinterpret that or reparse that.
Yeah.
Instead of thou shalt not, I wonder
Yeah.
if we should say, for crying out loud, don't. right?
Yeah, yeah,
Because it changes the veil. It's not an arbitrary thing like, well, I'm God and I make the rules.
right.
Instead, it's for
Yeah,
crying out loud. Don't you know what people are like? You know what society takes to function. You know what kind of life you want to live and how you want to be treated. For crying out loud, don't.
yeah, yeah.
And
Absolutely.
speaking of Calvin and Hobbes, who are my favorite cartoons of all time, um, those hard and fast rules that have no leeway in them are real easy to get around.
Mm,
There's
hmm.
a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon where it's his mother yelling, Calvin, are you in the bathtub? And he yells back from the bathroom, Yes, I am. And then it shows him sitting in the bathtub, fully clothed with all of his toys, no water, playing in the bathtub, which he was in the bathtub, just like his mother told him, but not doing what his mother told him. And we can do that with the Ten Commandments real easy too.
Oh yeah. I think you're right too, because it's almost like the more literalistic you get about them, the easier they are to circumvent. Whereas if there's, some idea that there's an intent behind them, you
But
know,
look at thou shalt not kill, how easy we've gotten
Mm-hmm.
around it.
oh yeah.
And we rationalized all kinds of things. But isn't it interesting? See, it goes back to trust,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Because what you need is a community of practice, right? You need a
Hmm.
social contract, a consensus, a system of accountability, right? Where we are mutually upholding a standard of good sense
Hmm.
and giving assent to the way these laws are being put into practice, right? And so that there is room for leeway, there's room for mercy, there's room for exceptions and whatever else, right? Like there's that it has elasticity, but that means throwing it to a trustworthy group. If you're
Yeah.
in a low trust setting, then you want. I mean, basically, you get into contract law,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Instead of it being we can figure this out together, it's we have to enumerate everything with an exhaustive glossary of definitions because there is no trust and we are concerned that there's going to be some loophole somewhere that can be exploited.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, and considering how much the vision of like a totally privatized, stateless, capitalistic, like free market libertarian society is
Hmm.
the preference of some people.
Hmm.
I call
Hmm.
them market authoritarians
Yeah.
because it's coming from exactly the same place of like if we it they don't it doesn't solve anything. Like
Hmm.
there is no substitute for trust in a community that is putting things into practice. But people will try to substitute contract law or they will try to substitute exhaustive legalism
Yeah.
um, so that they can try to guarantee that the bad thing is not going to happen. They can guarantee control rather than trusting that they live with a group of people
Yeah.
who will figure things out.
I really like your connection there between like the more authoritarian. Well, that the idea is that as trust falls, we get more litigious, that you have to get more fine detail because you can't trust, excuse me, you can't trust that someone's just going to do the right thing. I was when we were traveling in Europe 2 summers ago, I one of the kind of common things we talked about was how often we didn't see things like safety rails and on of course part of these are like 1,000-year-old castles or whatever. You're dealing with really old stuff, and so there's not a lot of OSHA regulations about how you navigate these spaces. And part of it is like, well, if you fall off and you were just too dumb to observe that there's an edge there, right? And there's probably not as much provision for suing people. They would have said, well, dumb cop. But here in the States where trust is very low, um, you do have to do a lot. I'm not saying we shouldn't do safety stuff. I'm just saying I think you're right. I think you see that reflected in kind of the assumption. Is someone going to be doing the smart thing over here, or are they going to be an idiot? And if you just assume people are idiots, which I think oftentimes we do in the States, then you really have to you have to CYA, you have to protect yourself against other people's idiocy. And that does seem to be an attitude. Like it's hard not to be cynical about that. Like, how could I get back behind that and be more trusting when I live in a society of very low trust?
But you know what? I think, if you think about like, um, living under Roman occupation,
Hmm.
I mean, there's certainly many layers of that being a low trust society. Like within certain circles, you would have
Yeah.
more trust, right?
Hmm.
But I mean, think about the mistrust that goes into, the social dynamics that we see with respect to, I mean, think about like tax collectors, right? And
Yeah.
we've talked about how they're implementing a protection racket, right?
Hmm.
There's so many drains on trust that are visible already in the world that Jesus is living in, right?
Right.
And I think it's interesting to look at the Sermon on the Mount,
Hmm.
to look at the practices of the early church, the counsel, right, that they are
Hmm.
given, the disciples are given. I mean, you can interpret this as, oh look, this actually is about building a higher trust group,
Mm.
right,
Hmm.
within society. Maybe that element of higher trust is part of what the leaven is needed for, if you take it
Yeah.
back to the parable of the leaven.
Mm. Mm. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is something about that. Like they really are, you see, they're really trying to create a different society that is more trusting and even implicit going way back into Genesis, right? The hospitality to strangers, welcome strangers because they could be angels, you know. That idea of we are going to welcome people even if they might be threats, that's part of our ethical obligation, but it also helps make us higher trust society, certainly.
Yeah, well, and it's not like being trusting, right, in sort of a
Hmm.
credulous way. It's also just,
Hmm.
what does it mean to live in a trustworthy fashion?
Hmm.
You get a
Hmm.
group of people who mutually are living in a trustworthy fashion, you've
Yeah.
created a pocket of trust, right?
Yeah. Hmm. That's a good, thank you for that insight. Yeah. By the way, I don't know if you know Bill Watterson, the author of Calvin and Hobbes, has a new book out. I haven't seen it yet, but
I have
after
it. Yes,
oh,
the
is it good?
mysteries. Yes, it is good.
Yeah. I look forward to reading it. Yeah. Other thoughts or reflections on law or our approach to it? I was disappointed Tony wasn't going to be here because I know he likes talking about the Ten Commandments.
Well, okay, so here's another thought on trust.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what emotional needs people meet by being authoritarian,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
So I mean, there's a chicken and an egg problem here, right? Because I think in a lot of ways you can also parse this through, or it's useful maybe to think about, well, do people even trust God?
Hmm.
Do they trust the goodness of God? Right?
Mm.
Um, like people want to know exhaustively what rules they're supposed to follow so that they can be confident that they're following them correctly. And
Right.
that correctness is their bastion of security, right? That's the foundation of their rectitude, their sense of personal worth, their sense of security, of safety.
Hmm.
And that's what they trust rather than trusting God in a more holistic sense of like, I'm convinced God is benevolent, God is love. I can put myself, I always think about what it was like taking a dog to a really good vet and
Right.
watching a dog relax and melt into them when that vet touched them. And the dog is like, oh, I get it. You know what you're doing. You can help.
Mm.
Right.
Hmm.
If people trust the goodness of God, or for that matter, the goodness of other people, right?
Yeah.
Relationships that are important to you, if you trust the goodness of your community, then it's different, right? That trust says, no, again, it's that we can figure it out, right? I
Hmm.
trust you're not going to hurt me. You're not out to get me. So, I mean, a lot of this probably goes back to people having some really messed up ideas about God
Mm.
that probably come from messed up relationships in their past, their own
Hmm.
parenting, right? The way they were brought up, the
Yeah.
religious traditions they've been molded by, where if you really peel it back, I don't think they trust the goodness of God either. So instead,
Hmm.
they're going to a contract law place with God.
Mm. Hmm. I think yes, I think that's a good insight. Oh, I kind of once again brings us back to the idea of trauma, right? That people who have never had that secure attachment or had that ability to trust that they're safe. I mean, because that really goes back to a question of safety.
Yeah,
And I think when you're dealing with um, theological ideas, it's, trusting that God is looking out for me and is not trying to penalize me or catch me doing something wrong.
yeah.
Um,
I
or
mean, you and Paula are pastors. How many
Mhm.
times has somebody brought you a question like, is it possible to lose your salvation?
Oh yeah, yeah,
I mean,
totally.
what kind of stack of category mistakes do we have to unpack to get to the bottom of that?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I even think that's part of that, the roots of the differences between kind of John Wesley's Arminianism and John Calvin is that people came to them with that very question. Is it possible to lose your
Mhm.
salvation? Or how do I really know that I'm really saved? And John Calvin said, well, you're either elected or you're not, so don't worry about it, you know? And John Wesley said, preach faith until you got it. Your heart will be strangely warmed and you'll have an assurance. And I'm thinking both of those answers are not satisfactory. Like neither of those is really people are still like, oh, I still don't have the assurance.
Mhm.
I mean, I work with people with OCD, so it's like they never have assurance. They never feel confident. And like, yeah, you're not going to feel confident. You're never going to have the assurance. Just lean into the discomfort of being uncertain.
I'm going to go for Captain Kirk, right? Choosing not to kill today. I
Yes.
think, maybe it's you can choose to be saved
Yeah.
today.
Yeah. Today. Yes.
Just
Are you saved?
you have,
Every day.
make your choice every day.
Every day.
This is what I want to be part of.
I'm saved now. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I thank you all for your discussion. I don't want to cut off too early, but any other words about this stuff? Well, I appreciate the conversation. I'm gonna go ahead and share the screen up so we can close our service today. And we've covered Calvin and Hobbes, Star Trek, the Bible, which I feel like we've hit the important ones. So thanks so much.
All right. This is our closing prayer from Fulbert of Chartres. How brief is our span of life compared with the time since you created the universe? How tiny we are compared with the enormity of your universe. How trivial are our concerns compared with the complexity of your universe. How stupid we are compared with the genius of your creation. Yet during every minute and every second of our lives, you are present within and around us. You give your whole and undivided attention to each and every one of us. Our concerns are your concerns, and you are infinitely patient with our stupidity. I thank you with all my heart, knowing that my thanks are worthless compared with your greatness. Amen.
God is love. Nothing is wasted. All things shall be well. Go in peace.
So thanks again for uh, joining us. Thanks those of you who are streaming. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, if you don't mind just clicking like or make a comment of where you're watching from, that gives us a way to count you with us today. I want to let you know that this afternoon, anyone who was thinking about doing the Christianity and Mystical Consciousness small group, I had to cancel it because this afternoon I'm speaking at an event of the Southeast Coalition for Psychedelic Practitioners, and I'm going to be doing a talk on spirituality and psychedelics. So we'll record that, and if those of you who are interested in the small group, I think it's relevant to what we're talking about, so I'll share that also. But that's here in Birmingham. If you're in here in Birmingham and you want to come to an event that happens from 2 to 6 at Clubhouse on Highland. So That's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for being with us. Those of you on Zoom, stick around for just a minute.